With that in mind, we've got 3 speakers today. Our first speaker is Mickey Leonard. Mickey Leonard is a researcher for our Secure Food Systems team at the University of Minnesota. She works with the team to produce our risk assessments for all species, and these are for continuity of business movements for the swine and poultry industries. We also work with the aquatic industry as well. Prior to joining the Secure Food Systems team, Mickey worked at the University of Minnesota's diagnostic laboratory, and that's where she found her interest in animal health and welfare, and that's where I stole her away and brought her to our team. So without any further ado, we have a progressive set of talks. We're going to talk about risk, then we're going to talk about how risk assessment, and then we're going to talk about a pathway analysis, all dealing with the swine industry because we're at the Leman Swine Conference. Take it away, Mickey.
Thanks, Marie. All right, so as Marie said, I'm Mickey Leonard, and I will be talking to you about what is acceptable risk. So let's just start off with what is risk? The World Organization for Animal Health defines risk as the likelihood of the occurrence and the likely magnitude of the biological and economic consequences of an adverse event or effect to animal or human health. So that's just a lot of words to say that, you know, you're going to figure out how likely something is going to happen, and then what's going to happen because that event occurred. And so when we're talking about swine and foreign animal diseases, we're concerned about what's the likelihood that a farm might be infected. And then with the Secure Food Systems team, our risk assessments that we conduct, we then are also looking at whether or not that spread might occur, and that could be to the farm or location that an animal or animal product is moving to, or we're also concerned about the risk of spread to other susceptible species, so other farms that are in the area or along the route. And as Marie was saying before, we are facilitating agricultural continuity of business with our risk assessments, and that's why we do this. These are science-based, so we're really looking at the way that these very specific pathogens react and move, and they're also collaboratively created. We work very closely with stakeholders, and so we have federal and state regulators that are on our teams. We also have veterinarians and other industry representatives, allied industries as well. Anyone who has some stake in this movement and this industry, we appreciate being on our team, so we fully understand what the full risk is. And then our risk assessments are both qualitative and quantitative. So I don't speak as much about the quantitative part today, but when we're thinking about quantitative, we're looking at that risk of actual transmission within a barn, that probability of detecting a virus that is in the farm before movement, and then also if you can detect the virus after movement to understand if maybe virus was introduced during loadout or at another point in the process. So WOA has this risk analysis framework that we also work on. And so you start off with your hazard identification, so you think about what is the pathogen that I'm concerned about? And so with swine, we've looked at FMD. We're now working on one with ASF. And you really need to understand what those concepts and the way that that virus is and works. From there, we go into the risk assessment. And so that's the evaluation of the likelihood and the biological and economic consequences of entry, establishment, and spread of that pathogen within a given region. So again, thinking about moving from farm A to farm B or farm A to slaughter, something like that. You're thinking about what might happen if that were to occur. Risk management is then taking what you've just thought about with that risk assessment, what you've just learned, and then putting in mitigations in place so that way you can implement these measures that can potentially reduce the level of risk. And then finally, bringing it all together, you have risk communication. So that's communication with your stakeholders, communication just with the industry, with regulators, making sure that there is open communication, understanding, you know, what risk was, what are the different things that went into this analysis, what are the different perceptions among risk assessors, the risk managers, these different things, and making sure that everyone understands what it is that occurred during this risk analysis. And so risk can be defined by an equation. So the risk of, in our case, moving infected but undetected animals or animal products is going to be the likelihood of moving those infected but undetected animals or animal products times the consequence of moving that uninfected but undetected animal or animal product. And so, again, that likelihood, the chance that your hazardous event can occur, and the consequence is that potential result of the hazardous event occurring. And so with the consequence, you need to remember that there are direct results, so spreading a pathogen, but then there are also going to be indirect consequences as well, thinking about financial implications, things that are going to affect the industry, that sort of thing. And situations are going to be different. So when you think about the different types of movements that could be occurring, those are going to come up with different risks. But even within the same type of movement, it's going to vary on a farm-by-farm basis because, as you all know, farms are not going to be the same across the industry. So you are going to be assessing it very individually, and depending on the circumstances of each event, your likelihood may be weighted higher than your consequence, or your consequence may be weighted higher than your likelihood. So they're not going to go into that with that exact same effect onto risk. And so risk can be impacted, and it can be impacted by things that we do, or it could just be impacted because of the way that things are. So if you were to have a farm that is in a very high density area, your likelihood of being exposed and having that infection is likely going to increase, which could then result in risk increasing. But you could also have things that affect the consequence, and that could decrease, which would also then reduce the risk. But you can really have any combination of increase or decrease in both likelihood and consequence, as well as, of course, the risk. When you think about how to come up with this overall risk determination, what we do is we qualitatively combine the likelihoods of individual pathways, assuming that all applicable preventative measures are in place. So, for example, the pre-movement isolation period, which I will explain in just a second. But when you think about how risk occurs and thinking about the overall movement, you're going to think about ways that a virus could enter into a farm, so those are going to be your input pathways. And when you're thinking about these pathways, you're not going to have, again, all of them be the same sort of weight. Some of these are going to affect your risk and your likelihood a lot more heavily than the others are. So that's always something you need to consider when going through a risk assessment. But we start with our input pathways, and then we put in place different mitigations. So start with this pre-movement isolation period, and then also add on some PCR surveillance to help bring down and mitigate that risk. From there, you might have more inputs though, and more risk coming in, or regarding spread. So then you have loadout and transport pathways, where again, you could have virus introduced into a farm and also start to think about the risk of spreading that virus. But we put in place even more mitigations to hopefully bring down that overall risk. And depending, the overall risk is going to vary in different sizes, and it might not just be one specific risk. There may be a range because there's a lot of uncertainty, but that's the general idea of how we get to an overall risk for a movement. So that pre-movement isolation period that I was just talking about is a critical biosecurity component of the process. And really, it's a time period of greatly intensified biosecurity for the entire premises prior to a permitted movement. And so some examples of that are no movement of live or dead animals onto or off of the premises in this amount of time. Only have critical operational visits coming onto the premises during this time. You'll also have manure and garbage not being removed from the premises. And then you're also going to be looking at a lot of enhanced biosecurity measures for people and vehicles. And so why is the PMIP so critical? Well, you have these requirements that are going to minimize the likelihood of a premises being exposed to a pathogen in the first place. And then you're going to also have it increase the likelihood of detection of an infected premises, because if you have more time for that virus to be on a farm, you're going to be able to have a higher likelihood of detecting it, which will then decrease that likelihood of moving infected but undetected animals or animal products. And again, you need to think about these potential unintended consequences as well. So you may have animal, public, and environmental health and welfare options that are happening. The economic state of things, again, these are just different unintended consequences. So you really have to think about the whole picture, as it could potentially turn into this sort of domino effect. Now, when we talk about risk, we have these specific risk ratings. So at the very severe end of things, we have extremely high, which is this event is basically, it's almost certainly going to occur. And if it does, these are going to be really severe or catastrophic results. And then you have high, moderate, and you're kind of ticking down the likelihood and also ticking down that consequence. And then you get down to negligible at the very other end of the spectrum, where it's really it's insignificant that if this event would occur because of results, or it's just really unlikely that it's going to occur, and it's not really worth considering. So these are the risk ratings that we use in our analyses. And another way to kind of look at that and remember or think about how likelihood and consequence come together, you can look at how you have these different levels, and also for the likelihood and the consequence, and how they can come together to come up with an overall risk rating. Now, I've talked a lot about kind of these different components and what they mean. So let's move through a potential example of how to calculate risk. And so I'm going to step away from the agricultural side of things just for a second for ease of talking through this. And so let's consider what the risk of me tripping while leaving the podium after this talk is going to be. So let's start with the likelihood. I know myself. I feel pretty confident that I know how to walk and I've got good balance today, but that's possible. So I'm going to call it low to moderate. There's that uncertainty that I was talking about before, where you're going to have a range of possibilities of what could occur. Now let's think about the consequence. You know, it could be a little trip and the only thing that happens is I have a little hurt ego. Or I could really biff it and hurt myself physically. So I'm going to call that low to high, because I'm not really sure what could happen. There is a lot of uncertainty. So when I think about the overall risk, weighing these different likelihoods and consequences, I think it's going to be a moderate risk. It's pretty unlikely, but it could occur. And, you know, the consequences have a range of what could happen. So we've got a moderate risk, and we'll see what happens at the end of my talk, how well I do. Now, moving into the risk management side of things, these are going to be, like I was talking about before, those mitigations that are going to help reduce your risk. So after you have your risk analysis done and you have identified what those risks are, we're going to use scientific principles to create these mitigations. And you may have national or international mitigations considered, so things that are already out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can borrow what other people are doing. And we found out that that can be a really useful thing, because some people are like, oh, that's a good idea. That's one great thing about our work groups, is we get to learn these sorts of things. Another important thing with risk management is making sure that these measures are feasible. We want to make sure that farms are going to be able to do them, especially when you have these greatly enhanced biosecurity measures. you can't just change everything about your farm and the way that things are running at the drop of a dime. So you just really need to think about what could we reasonably put in place. And again, this is going to involve stakeholders so that you can understand and determine whether or not these are going to be feasible measures and really how effective they are. And when we're thinking about acceptable risk, the selected mitigations must result in some appropriate level of protection. You want to make sure that you're putting forth mitigations that are going to reduce that risk. And so what are some examples of risk management? On a larger scale, you have good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, standard operating procedures, and also the enhanced targeted surveillance that you're going to be putting in place. And looking even specifically for some real life examples, having Danish entries or having something that has perceived higher protection, such as a shower in, shower out facility. And you also want to ensure that these procedures are being followed. Another example is having required dedicated PPE for farm and barn level entry. And thinking about the other side of things, not just what you can do at the first farm, but what your destination premises is. If you're moving animals to a single age farm, if you have that opportunity, you're not going to be potentially spreading disease to those other animals that are already on the farm. So you do have a slightly lower consequence in those regards. Now, maximizing that risk management, you can layer these different mitigations and you can have this enhanced protection. Each additional mitigation can help manage that risk, but you do need to think about the fact that not all mitigations are going to measure risk equally. And so an example of this is thinking of how we measure these different levels. So you're going to see some tables very similar when Caitlin gives her talk in just a minute. But if we start off with our industry biosecurity standards, maybe you have something that has low to moderate likelihood. And then you're going to layer on whatever your secure supply plan, so in our case, secure pork supply, what their enhanced biosecurity recommendations are. And from there, you might be able to lower that likelihood down to low. And then on top of those two already good biosecurity measures, you could add on that targeted enhanced biosecurity measures that we've been talking about, things that are developed with the stakeholders. And that could bring you down even lower potentially. So you're going to want to think about what these layered mitigations could be. And another way to think about that, as we've all seen with COVID, kind of the Swiss cheese approach where, if you just have one piece of Swiss cheese, you're going to have a higher likelihood. But then once you start layering on more, it's possible that you're going to get more protected by the end of this. Now, thinking about minimizing risk, you're never going to be able to achieve zero risk, but you can reduce it to acceptable levels. So again, assess those potential hazards, implement mitigations to reduce likelihood, and when possible, consider changes to reduce consequences. Now, finally, getting back to the big question, what is acceptable risk? I've talked to you about what risk is, ways that we can help management. Now, what's acceptable risk? And unfortunately, I don't just have a single answer for you. It's going to be vary by case. So again, depending on what kind of movement you're doing, what kind of farms you have, the different types of animals, it's going to vary greatly. So you do need to assess it on a case-by-case basis. This is going to be a collaboration between regulatory bodies and industry. It's a nice way, again, to have those two pieces working together. Certain measures that are going to be put in place for determining whether or not risk is acceptable are going to be policy, and so they're regulated, again, by those state and federal agencies. But then you have these other additional measures that maybe not all farms can put in place, but you could specifically put in place that would help lower your own personal risk. And really, just kind of the bottom line is you want to think about What level of risk are you willing to allow? What are you going to feel comfortable with? And again, that's that discussion with the regulatory bodies when you're trying to decide whether or not a movement can occur and whether or not you should attempt it. And so with that, I'd like to thank the rest of the Secure Food Systems team. We all work together on creating these risk assessments, and our modelers do a lot of really great modeling to give that quantitative view that, again, I didn't touch on today, but they do a lot of really good work. And we also, of course, couldn't do this without funding and support from our partners, USDA SIA, USDA NIFA AFRI, USDA APHIS FADPREP, the state of Minnesota, and other ag industry groups. And so with that, I would like to open the floor to any questions.
Thank Mickey. And then we've got 2 microphones, one on this end, one on that end, on this interdisciplinary talk, setting the stage for what is appropriate risk. Any questions from the audience? Going once, going twice, going 3 times? No, we can take our time for that.
I guess I'm just that great a presenter that nobody has any questions. Everything is completely solid in their minds.
No, of course I have a question for you, Mickey, is we're getting at the risk discussion, and I think you put it up there about that the science has to be there as well to inform that. And so how do you balance when you're getting at acceptable risk, balance personal experiences, the empirical data, like once I saw this, versus the published data? How do you balance that out there with a diverse work group, and especially if we think of the poultry side that you've worked a lot with, and to any of the work groups? How do you balance that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are going to have these different experiences that people will have. And so one thing you think about is how representative is this of your risk assessment and farms in general? So that's one thing you think about, making sure that they're actually some sort of representative farm or body. But you also want to make sure that there is that evidence supporting these different thoughts. If there's more evidence kind of against one argument than there is for it, that's something that you want to consider. But then we also have these work groups that are made up of a lot of different experiences and people and experts, and they're also able to put forth their thoughts onto things. So whether or not other people have experienced this as well is something that we can also take into consideration when we're doing these risk assessments and coming up with final risk determinations.
And I guess any other questions from the audience, because I could have one more. You have one. Go ahead. You have one. Oh, you personally.
Yes. No, thank you very much for a great presentation. My question is a bit further down the line. That sometimes you get once you're done with this stage, you need to communicate that risk, and then you have people with different risk appetite and perception. And I was just wondering how you've navigated that space, given the different projects that you've had to work with.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a variety of different ways in which you can communicate risk and our findings. So firstly, a lot of times when we go to conferences like this, we're able to have very specific examples. And so again, like Caitlin's about to present on, where these are some of the results for this very specific risk assessment we're doing. And so what we're going to do is talk about that specifically, but then we also will layer it where we have worked very closely with individual farms and also with individual state and federal regulators to kind of help work through that on a case-by-case basis. So that's another thing where our team is there for those outreach opportunities where we like to be able to provide the support since we're very familiar with it. And our risk assessments are pretty lengthy. They're close to about 200 pages, so there's a lot to sift through there. And we also create these permit guidances, which is just kind of condensed information, really pulling out those important pieces that you can implement. And that's just another way that we're able to share the information in a little bit more of an understandable
John Corzine has a question. Sure you do.
Increased surveillance, whether it's laboratory or patent or just visual, is that considered mitigation, or because you're really not going to stop an infection, you're just going to find it earlier? How's that classified?
So it is a mitigation because what you're going to do is spread. I don't know. All right. If I just hold it and hope for the best at this point. But yeah, so mitigation in a way where we're thinking about reducing that spread of disease. So even though you would unfortunately be detecting that disease and you're not getting a benefit out of it at that point, you are able to at least try and stop it before it gets too bad. And you're also thinking about that viral load where, you know, at least maybe you're not going to be spewing out a lot of virus into the environment, or you know, just these other considerations that you're not going to have to be, you know, you should be concerned, of course, but maybe not as concerned when you're doing cleanup and things like that. If you're going to be having those smaller viral loads by catching it when you only have one boar, perhaps, versus having 10 boars that are positive.
One last question. Yes.
It's a quick question. So do you do your risk assessments at the farm, or do you do them remotely? And if you do them remotely, what drove that decision?
So we do them remotely, but if we do have the chance to be able to go to farms, I'd certainly never say no. There's been a couple of times where we've been able to go out to farms and talk with people, and that's really great. But for the most part, we just do remote Zoom work group things where we just kind of walk through what these pathways are. So we really think about the entire process of everything that's going on for a movement. Semen for boar semen, Alan's going to be talking about. We really think about what are the different steps going into this whole process. We work with our stakeholders and our industry representatives to tell us what's going on. And then we're also being able to conduct a literature review at the same time to kind of put both of those pieces together. And from there, we just try and come up with a way to be the most representative that we can. But then if you do have a farm that were to, you know, really want that additional help, really understand their personal risk, that's something that probably would be better done on an individual farm. We are able to talk about their individual experiences, but then at the same time, you have those regulators who are going to be out at the farm too, so they might be able to help you out in that regard.